So Aaron, do you have anything that you'd like to share about what happened?
Yeah, I think my case I'm assuming might be a little different since I've already had a website and been playing around with it for a long time. So I'm happy to go last or first, whatever's clever. So
Well, you've got experience as a web developer. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and then about
okay,
your website?
sure, sure. So when I guess okay, so starting a website basically began when I knew that the end of my graduate program was coming, and I saw the competition, and I knew that if I could build a better website than they were, maybe I'd be able to get a job. So it started with this desire just to have something to play around with, to have a project, but also to contribute to my career. And when I first got started with it, it was like an absolute disaster. Like nothing looked good, nothing seemed cohesive. Like it was just a mess. But as soon as something like looked good, like as soon as I found like a foothold in something, I realized that it gave me a lot of energy back. So I did some digging around, and for the record, I'm using WordPress, but I've been using a theme called Enfold, which was like $60 when I bought it, and it's made the process exceedingly simple, which is great. But this class sort of helped reinvigorate my engagement with my website, revisiting a lot of my assets and taking away some of the best practices that maybe I didn't even know existed in the first place, since I was just sort of taking shots in the dark and seeing what happened. So I hope that's a good overview on where I'm coming from. I'd be happy to show off what I have when that time is right.
Yeah, we're gonna have uh, yeah, we're gonna have time for a little bit more show and tell later on.
Okay.
We're gonna talk about a dedicated show and tell time at the end that we're gonna consistently do after class, and so the hope is that we can get there. Um, and so we're just sort of briefly trying to get a feel for. There's lots of different experience levels in the room, lots of different experiences that you probably had. Like, how many of you have tried WordPress this week? I see in the room, I've got 3, 4 hands going up. And so, around, it's hard to maybe see with the camera. People in there. Anybody, and Anna through the remote. How about trying Wix? Anybody try Wix? It's a common one. It's also got its quirks. And then, anybody do Squarespace? Anybody try Squarespace? No. That one, like, very quickly wants you to pay for it. So good call there. Trying to avoid be as free as possible is a good plan. There's lots of different things. One thing that I heard, and I wish our audio was better. The show and tell might go a little bit better at this point. We'll fix it during the bathroom break that's going to come up. But the key thing is that there's a lot of things about building a website that can be frustrating at the onset, and choosing a platform can be part of that frustration. So we've got several things that I want to just go over, talk about, and consider sort of as we're discussing that process. And then I'm going to try really hard to make a case for just writing the code of your website on your own, for the fact that then at least the mistakes are your own, which is a really, Jamie said that at some point earlier in the week. It's a really just spot on phrasing, right? I think the reason why I prefer to write code, but there's many platforms and all can equally get your presence out there and on the internet, whether it's with some tool that you buy and you pay for and does some things, whether it's a free platform, there's lots of options. But we're going to talk about sort of the management strategies to how to go from an idea to a website, and then some of the tools that it takes to get you there. And then some of the tricks that you can use to, even if you have something that isn't really intended for writing lots of code, where you can inject in clever ways some code pieces that are really useful. So, anybody in the room want to share about your experience this week? Like good things, bad things, frustrations, sort of how it went? Yeah, well, gotta. Would you like to come up and talk? We're going to talk about the plan in a minute.
Hello, everybody. So I experimented with building my site mainly through GitHub. I started with the template that Corey provided, then modified a few things. I got stuck in trying to upload a video file that was a little too big. And I'll be honest, I started a little late, so I was kind of scrambling this last day. But I'm probably going to go with the written code because of the flexibility and the customizability of it. And I hope to build something quite a bit more elaborate whenever show and tell comes up. So, all right, thanks.
All right, thank you. Anybody else want to share who's physically here? And let me say that close to the microphone. Anybody else who's physically here want to share anything? Yeah? You want to come on up? Thank you. Yeah, let's see if it works.
I didn't end up settling on a single platform, but I learned a fair amount of HTML and CSS, which I'd only played with once or twice before. And then I tried out these two platforms. One is Figma, and one is Editor X, which are both like much more granular control than most like template websites or like template web services. Figma I had some trouble with at first, and like I didn't think that it's like onboarding for new users it was just a little bit hard to understand, and it was a little bit hard to actually find where their templates were to begin, rather than, it was easy to see how you would start one from scratch, but to be able to just like investigate the elements of the site and what it offered, it took a little while, but it does seem cool now that I have some understanding of what it is.
Awesome.
And Editor X is part of Wix, which I didn't realize until I was working on it a little bit.
That's good. That's awesome. Cool. Thank you for sharing. All right, and then let's see. Anybody feel compelled to share? There's going to be a full show and tell a little bit later. So if you're still building up gumption, that's totally fine. Yeah, we should probably just get going on the things so that we move through with the stuff that we have to go through. So I'm gonna hop over to the screen. Are we presenting?
Right on, yeah, just you. You want the screen?
Let's do the screen. We'll throw that up there.
Well, I need those.
Oh, it might be.
I got it, here.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right. So on here, we're just sort of working our way through. Thank you. We're working our way through the Unit 1.2 content. So we're going to take a look at what's here. We're going to talk about some of these things. I even put together a small set of slides to try and understand a couple of the project things better, to sort of visualize what's happening with that. And I'll link those in probably right here in a little while. But as we're doing that, we're going to talk about project planning, but just based on what people had to say. What I want to do is first go through sort of a little bit about HTML and CSS. That these are really things that it can take a lifetime to master. This stuff for learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you're just getting started with them, it's totally fine if your transition into understanding them is a little bit rocky. There's lots of tools that will be useful, and I'm going to point out some things that can be really helpful in a little while. But as you're going through, I've got in here some videos that do short explanations of how they work. Those were relatively recent additions. And then these entire reference pages where you can go through W3 schools and you can see like the entire reference list for all of the elements in HTML. So there's tons and tons of things in here, and it would take a long time to like even have read this, let alone wrap your head around how they're related. And so there's lots of elements that we can absolutely take a look at and try and make sense of. But as we talk about that, there's HTML, so that's the markup language, the actual content that's going to be on the page. If you use one of my templates, and we're going to see what it looks like to upload one of those in a minute, if you use one of those, that's the stuff that's on the page. You might have had one that broke its link to CSS at some point if you're building relative links out. And if that's the case, then you might have gotten the page to load without any sort of a background or any color to it. And that would be just a break between your HTML and CSS. Then you've got JavaScript, which is the one that in the template isn't used almost at all, but it is the way that you can sort of make things move. And to put those three things into sort of reference with each other, I really liked this video that's up here on the left. This lady does a great job of sort of explaining how the three work together, that you essentially can consider HTML the construction worker, CSS the artist, and JavaScript the wizard, right? And so the video is delightful. She does a good job of explaining sort of how those three fit together. And in the class, really all you're going to need to know is how to use the basics of any of these, right? You can go very, very deep with all of them, and it's exciting, but it can take years and years and years for that to develop. The few things that I do want to talk about are just to take a quick look at the CSS cheat sheet, because of the three, the one that can be the most cryptic, I think, is CSS. The markup is sort of outright, you're writing things that show up on the page. CSS is a little bit trickier because you've got all of these different ways that you can identify stuff. And so this is a bit small, I realize that. Let's see if I can make this any larger. Yeah, we can. Good, they wrote their CSS well. But you've got ways that you can identify different, and there's lots of ads, ways that you can identify, I wanted to find, let's see. When you're identifying different things in your CSS, you often use this selector syntax. So if we're looking at that, the CSS is written so that you've got some way to identify what it is you want to be styling, and then in the brackets are the styles you'd like to apply. So if you want to have a background color, if you want the text to be a certain color, that's just color. And you've got ways to do that. The way that the example, the template that I gave out, related those is through an external CSS file. So it's linked this way, and if your href wasn't the right file path, then that would have led to that broken link. And so there's a lot of sort of quirkiness to that, but the parent file to go up a folder, you might have found is // to move backwards, and we can point that out when we get some code up on screen. But then, importantly, there are items over here, the selectors that you can choose to really identify what you need to have. There's lots of ways that you can combine selectors in CSS to give certain things a look and style. But the two main ones are classes and IDs. And so classes in CSS style are going to be preceded with a period to set a class of things, and that's a style you'd like to apply multiple places. And then the hashtag is the ID, and that can be useful for CSS. But then another place where it's really useful is you can link to your particular page, so to places in your page. So if you give a heading or a paragraph or an image an ID, we're going to find that you can link to that as you're building out navigation. So IDs can be linked to, and there's a few pieces like that that are useful. But coming back, there's lots and lots and lots of stuff about all of this. And so the depth that you want to go after those is sort of a choose your own adventure to some extent. Some people are going to want to go really deep and understand this and know that this is the foundation, and there are years of work that you could do to really develop that. But just getting sort of the basics of how do I draw a button, how do I put in an image, that's sort of the level that we're going for. Not necessarily for full styling, and Figma and those tools can be great ways to transition into that so that your visuals are on point. But at this point, it's important to keep the scope of our project really tightly managed. And so to that end, I have here's the presentation. So I want to start off and talk about a few things that can happen with our projects and sort of how this works over time. and how projects can really grow and get a little crazy. So we're gonna full screen this, and then I should be able to F11. Yeah. All right. So we're gonna talk a little bit about projects and sort of how they can go, and not so much thinking about the HTML, but just as a general plan for how things are gonna work over time in the class. And so we're gonna talk about projects, and then this is also gonna cover Git, and then I'll show you live, like here in class, how Git works and how it will save everything you've ever done for all of your projects. So we're gonna make sense of Git and GitHub today so that we can have anything that you've written be uploaded, hosted for free, and it'll back up and save all of the work that you've done. Whether that's for your HTML and website, or if you're using a service like Wix where all that's saved for you, how to just back up the files that you're developing for the things that you're making. So, first up, we're gonna talk about projects. And as we're talking about projects, especially with websites, and I really love the example that you gave, Aaron, because it's great to have a website that can cover lots of bases for you, but I'm always gonna caution against this specter, scope creep. Scope creep is a term that's really common among, am I pointed?
You're good.
Yeah, okay. Scope creep is a really common problem for any sort of engineering process. It may be something that you've heard people talk about in a business sort of setting before, but scope creep is a real problem where if you have a project and you're like, well, it'd be great if it could do this thing too, right? Or if we added in this feature, or if it was two birds with one stone, is often a really enticing idea to have that project that solves many things at once. But it can also be sort of your downfall. It's going to be a constant problem, especially in here as a maker. I'm always encouraged to add that one more feature to a project that I'm working on. But you've got to really consider scope creep a major difficulty that you could have in any one of your projects. That you could start to think of ways that it could grow, and that's where this gets tricky. Like for several of you, I've been impressed and enjoyed looking over your portfolios for work, but I would be careful about choosing to make and it can be good, but be careful about choosing to make the portfolio for this class the exact same as the other one that you have for your art. Because there may be weeks that you don't want to share, or there could be reasons to keep them isolated, and then take the content that you develop week to week in this class, and then move that into your portfolio as appropriate, right? When you want to show it off, you do that. It does two things. One, it keeps it limited. The portfolio for this site is just for the class, and you're not trying to do two jobs at once, to self-advertise and to do the work for the class. But it also gives you that choice to move things over, and you're not sort of forced into having it all linked together. So it depends on your goals for what exactly you want your portfolio to be, but trying to keep things isolated is a really important part of fighting scope creep, that your job on one particular task stays limited to that one particular task. And so it's important to know what your goals are and to know like how you can solve a problem without really spreading into multiple areas. So it's important and tricky to do this one. It's a constant battle. But we're going to talk about sort of 5 project management strategies to help you fight against scope creep in general and other sort of strategies that will generally be useful in the course. So as we do that, I just want to go through them in this order. So first is demand and supply time management. So there's a lot of words on the slide, which I don't really love. I should have changed it to be less. But you've got demand side management and supply side management. Demand side management, the big takeaway is that the project is in charge. The project grows and needs more time, something fails, and you need to take a different perspective. When you have a project that has pieces that need to go in a certain order, the project can really be in charge, and the demands of the project are what drive it. For supply side management, you look at the time that you have for a given week or for a particular thing that you want to do, and that supply side management means that you say, I have 10 hours this week, I'm normal week load. You can scope your project to fit the time that you have. If you have a particularly open week, you may expand that, take on a little bit bigger task, or you may say that this is something that has to happen quickly because I've got a job interview, right? Those sorts of things happen, they come up, and I think it's important that as we think about how we're moving forward with the class, we're going to need to take those things into consideration. We good with the mouse, Kate? Okay, cool. I'll give it back to you. We're going to also talk about series and parallel project development. So there's, and in web development, it can be tricky because you're writing, your attention can only be in one place at a time, and you're really doing a lot of the work. But series and parallel project development styles are two methods that we're going to go with. So series projects all have to go sort of in a sequential order, and it's a piece that's tricky. And in web development, this is very often true. If you're writing a website, you're signing up, it kind of has to be in the sequential order. And as you're building and developing projects, that's the method that you have to follow. But we're going to encourage every time that we can that you follow a parallel project sort of development. And this is a waterfall chart. It's a way to think about doing things in parallel, right? So as we get later on in the course, you might be building something that has a few different processes going. You might need a circuit board and a 3D print and a few other things. And it would be awesome if you could set the 3D print, walk away from that machine, let it do its thing, and then you're working on something else on the other side. You know, as you're waiting for the laser to finish cutting, you're writing up the documentation so that you're getting double duty out of your time. All skills that I'm sure that you've all developed. It's just good to hear. You know, one more time as a background. You want to think about ways that you can optimize your time and sort of as you're planning out what to do for the week. The supply side management would be thinking about that schedule, and then this really integrates with that so you can think about where can I use my time to double count? Where can I set something up to work over the course of a day, and then I can take care of some other business that's either related to this, related to life outside of this class. You know, taking care of multiple things at once is always a great strategy. And so the big takeaway here is that you'll want to try and find workflows that are parallel whenever you possibly can. And the web is probably not a great place to start with that because it's so sequential and logical and ordered. But as we move into woodworking next week, you'll want to think about, well, what can I do while my piece is gluing up, right? What's the other step that I can be doing? Can I work on getting a badge on something else? Sort of how do those pieces all fit together? And so parallel project development is really an important piece to take into account, and thinking ahead so that you can working on a project in a way so that you can even be planning ahead is very helpful. A few more project management tips. We've got bottom up and top down development. These are development styles that really can be thought about at great length. Up here I've got, for example, 3 different pictures of Legos. In the 2000s, I wanted to look up the date but couldn't exactly find it. You know, the Harry Potter castle in Lego is a beautiful design. They go for like $500 if you can find them at all on eBay. They're really nice. I'm hoping to find one for my wife at some point. But you know, it's a high level piece of Lego. Back in the 80s, it was much simpler. The kits were often smaller. Their pieces were still sort of there. They had just transitioned into ABS plastic not that long prior. And so the development and the design of those projects were a lot smaller in scope, right? And then back in the 60s, and I actually read up on the history of Lego this week, they started in the late 1800s with wooden blocks. And then they transitioned eventually into these bricks. And they were sold just as regular Lego bricks for a long time. And then eventually kits and designs and those sorts of tools came up. But the key element is that they started from those simple beginnings and then became more complex as those pieces were proven, right? You have to prove the simple parts work and then go from there. And in the case of writing code, that means find some simple lines of code that you can manipulate so that you understand how those pieces work before you try and jump into the most complicated designs, right? Put the simple pieces together and then from that try and build an aggregate that's more complicated. It's hard to start from a very complex beginning point and then figure out how to build the pieces from there. Always, as much as you possibly can, try and start at the lowest level, building out the simplest things. When we get to electronics, how do you blink an LED? Don't try and build an entire lighted display with scrolling text before you figure out how to blink the one LED, right? Keeping that all in mind as you design and work forward is really an important part of making things happen. We've also got, modular designs. So when you're putting together your designs, it's often going to be very helpful if you have some modularity. And so in the case of our particular class, and what's going on right now, is that in the website, right, you have modular designs when you have an external style sheet. So when your CSS is in a separate file, then that's a separate module that you can attach to your HTML files. And so those links make it so that each piece is sort of separated, and then if you have a separate file, if you want to style something uniquely in a unit, it can keep it modular so that you don't have one big thing that can all break at the same time. The opposite of modular is the monolithic projects, which are sort of big, impressive things, but you get one shot to have them work, and when they fall and collapse, they usually all collapse together, right? There's a lot of different pieces to make things work. And so another good example for this would be like a stone arch bridge, right? If you have a stone arch bridge, you lose the wrong stone out of the arch bridge, you can lose the entire thing. They're sort of a monolithic item. But if you've got an array of stone arches, like in the Colosseum, a few of them fall apart, but others still stay together, right? So as it becomes more and more modular, you can have strength in those pieces and know that some of them work. Another big piece of advice that we're going to have as you're going through the class is that you want to document as you go. And so documenting as you go is a really essential piece. And so as we're talking about it for web design, hopefully you're taking screenshots. And so if you have been, that's awesome. You store them somewhere and then put those together. I had a good discussion this afternoon with Rogata about the value of using a service like Flickr, so that maybe you take those images, you can save them somewhere, and then you can reference them on your website as you'd like later. So that sort of documenting as you go is really important. And also the written part of your documentation. So writing notes as you go can be really helpful. But if you write them in such a way that they're sort of readable by anybody, then you're writing your website's written content at the same time. So making use of that as sort of a parallel task, and also as a way to manage what's going on is really valuable. So those are some management strategies that we just wanted to go through to take a look at how this happens, because there's lots of different pieces that can go awry, and I'll be reminding you of these 5 strategies regularly throughout the course. But the big one that I wanted to cover, and the big thing that I really want to talk about a lot today, is Git, and sort of how that will interact with the things that we're doing. So I just want to introduce you to Git as a program, which is separate from GitHub. It's separate from GitLabs. There's many, many different pieces to where Git has fit into ecosystems. And so on this slide, there's the main Git webpage is Git SCM. And so Git SCM is really the center of it. It's a source control manager is what it was intended for. It was originally designed and written so that you could have, or to help with the development of Linux, the operating system, and its kernel. So that resource, the Git resource, was built in order to manage code and code changes. So it's very good at looking at files and seeing how changes in each line of code can be documented, and compressing that data so that it saves backups that are complete and really secure, but it's able to granularly take into account small changes to files. So as we're thinking about this, and there's a lot on each one of these pages, but it's a distributed system. There are several ways to back up things that you're developing, but this Git has a power of being distributed. So Git works by having multiple users that can be collaborating on the same project, and each user essentially has a complete copy of the project in its entirety. And so how does that relate to you is that you will be doing your work for this class and essentially have 2 versions of yourself. You'll have the version of you that is on a computer. So if you have a computer in front of you, the files that are on there, that will be one version of you. And then if you sign up for GitHub, which is a service that lets you create a digital version of yourself on their platform, then you can make an entire separate repository there so that you have all of the files locally stored on your computer, but then they're completely stored on their remote server as well as a total backup. You also don't need GitHub to do this. I've done projects where I make one repository on the laptop that I have, and then another one on a computer, on a Raspberry Pi in my house, so that I've got a duplicate copy of the project that I'm working on, so that if anything ever happened to my laptop, which has happened before, where I fried it with back voltage through USB ports, and it's rough. But just keeping a backup for a project that you're really invested in is essential, and Git does all of that for you. So yeah.
Question, so why do something like GitHub or something like that rather than just having everything on your laptop and then backed up to some cloud or some network drive or whatever?
No, that's a very good question, and thank you for asking. And I forgot to highlight the importance of question asking. If you've got any, please let us know so that I can answer as appropriate. This is really helpful because it's such a short threshold to do a full backup, right? If you go through the commands that you need to do to make it work, which is git add, star, git commit, and a little message, and then git push origin master, those 3 commands, which can take all of 2 minutes, you've got a full and complete backup that's stored remotely so that everything's there. There are other ways to do it. You can use Dropbox, you can use Google Drive, all of those are totally fine. But then you typically need to have some sort of manual pull back and forth, right? And then as a byproduct also of using Git, if you use it with the service GitHub, which we're gonna totally be recommending in a minute, is that you can use that as the platform to host your website from, right? So in addition to backup, you also get the website hosting. So it's like a 2-for-1 deal. And then if you pay for GitHub, you can keep all those things secret if you're really developing like, business secrets that you want to keep or, other whatever secrets you've got. But in addition to just having the backups, let's see, I lost the cursor.
There's one other
You've got
thing.
it also keeps a complete log of every change that's ever happened. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second.
Corey,
But
you had
this
an
is- You can see just this document here that it will go through and validate every bit that you put in and every bit that you pull out of Git. So it has a full checksum, which is just a way to validate sort of what's happening and how those things are linked. It all comes together in a way that you can keep track of every single bit that moves in and out of the Git system. So it's really robust for data backup sort of services. And then this slide is taken directly from me playing around with the foundations of fabrication thing. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit on the cursor. Yeah, okay, we can do this. So in here, there's a command that is,
We had something from Aaron.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I was just going to say really quickly too that a service like this uses the command line interface, right?
Yeah.
And a command line at first you're like, whoa, it's coding, like this is complicated. But there's something really nice about just using one line at a time and not having the pressure of having to sort of figure out how everything comes together. I'm not like a super technical person, but I have learned to love the simplicity of the command line. So.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, Aaron. I think that finding that ability to use a command line to use tools is really going to be an essential way to try and make your life a little bit easier. And so as we do, and as that command line stuff comes together, there's many other pieces that can be very helpful. Sort of the developers of this didn't have to focus on the logistics of making a GUI. They can instead focus their efforts on making it as useful as possible. And so you've got things like this log, where I put in this git log command. Let me hover right over it. Just the 6 characters, git log, and then what comes out below is a complete list of every change I had made to my Git repository. So it pulls up every single change, every single commit that I had done, so that I could go back and look at every one of those. I could verify what it was like. If I had made a change that I didn't want, I could go back to a previous version and just start working from there. So all of those things are really helpful. Yeah?
I don't exactly know what Aaron means by focusing on one line at a time as if it's terminal. Is that like a GML or lines?
No, he's talking about he's talking about how you can put in commands just with a little bit of text. And so you don't have to worry about the user interface or like what buttons are where and how that might change over time. I think Kate was talking about how WordPress looks very different now than the last time you used it. And so that sort of quirkiness all goes away when you're using the command line. You can think about just the command that you want to give, and that's all that you have to focus on. So you've got that sort of upgrade in usability. And so you also get these benefits that come through as just a, as just a, having your log and having the log all put together, you get this list of all of the different backups that you've had. But that storing and getting into that log can be a little bit confusing. So I want to take a look at the process of how you go from having your files that you're working on and getting them saved in that way. This is the thing that you're most frequently going to be doing with Git. You'll have a working directory. And so the working directory is the files that are stored locally on your computer. So while you're working on your project, whether it's the website or whether it's just the files for things that we'll be making later, like STL files for 3D prints, vector files for the laser, all of those different sorts of files, you'll have them inside of a folder that's being monitored by Git. And so that folder that's being monitored by Git, if you make any changes to it, you'll need to tell Git that you'd like it to make a save point. And so once you make those changes, you can stage that, you can get them into the staging area by running the git add command, where you just type in those 6 letters and then maybe a star for git add all of my changes. And then once you have that, they're stored in a sort of staging area where the next step is that you commit them. So then you can commit, which actually builds out the log of files that the last slide had. So where I had each one of those log items, that was where I made a commit that's a save of all the files and everything that have been done. And then when you have that, then it gets stored as a commit in your repository, which is a hidden file folder that's inside of the one that is your working directory. And so we'll look at all this in a second. I've got enough up here for a live demo in a second. But once it's in that repository, then you do the git push origin master command, and you'll push it to your remote version of yourself. So not only is this log of everything there, it's also stored remotely so that all your files are there and the complete log of everything is there. So if anything happens to your personal device, you can immediately retrieve it all and see what happened from that remote resource. So being able to push your information through this backup cycle is really important. But it's hard to make sense of that, I think, until you see it. And then even harder is that there are many services that go along with this that use the power of this software as the basis for their model for profitability. So just really quickly, we're going to recommend that you use GitHub, which is owned ultimately by Microsoft at this point. It's had some different issues, but it's a cloud service that lets you use Git with their remote servers. And from there, you can also host web pages and lots of different things. GitLab is a similar service. It's just one that we're not going to recommend this time, although we thought about setting up a GitLab server just for the class. It's got a little bit more flexibility, GitLab, but maybe not quite the staying power that GitHub has apparently, that is apparent for GitHub right now. And then there's Amazon Web Services. They also have a Git-based interface where you can use Git with Amazon's web services, because Amazon is now a major player in hosting websites where your servers are actually stored and managed by Amazon, the company, and then they use this as sort of their way to push things forward. There's even, and I would need to check the numbers to really be sure, but I've heard that the Amazon Web Services is becoming a bigger profit source for Amazon than even Amazon retail sales. That just their web services and that logistics infrastructure may be a larger player in how they make money, which is wild, right? That sort of a piece, that hidden part of Amazon that doesn't feel immediately apparent is so profitable, is really valuable. It shows why there's people all want to sort of conflate their names with this service of Git and cloud services, right? So there's some complexity to decode there. But as we do, I just want to show you the value in this and sort of sees what happens. One of the things that's going to happen when you have Git is you'll need to get yourself set up. And so there's a few commands that you need to do to get yourself going. And I want to pull up VS Code, and then also, sorry. Let's grab this over here. So over here what I've got is Visual Studio Code. And so this is that template that I had pulled from all of you, or that I pushed up, and there's a video showing off how this works. But if I go to GitHub, I'm logged in to my account, my account that's tied to my MakeHaven name. And so here, let me zoom out just a touch. So this is tied to my MakeHaven name, and then there's this template page piece that is got a little bit. But what I want to do here is take and just make is to try and connect this to that remote repository. So,
Corey,
yeah.
Is your GitHub repository with your MakeHaven email, is that publicly available?
It is publicly available. GitHub is, the free tier for GitHub is always publicly available. You have to pay to put your things behind a bit of a paywall.
But, so you could send us the link so that we could
Absolutely.
download templates from there.
Yep, you can fork the repository that I'm going to have up here. You can see sort of how this all works. And these tools are really helpful in getting back and forth between the two items.
So is it all open though? Like, can anyone come on and
Yeah,
see
so,
what you're doing?
yep, anybody can come in and take a look at what I've got. And in GitHub up here, you can, if you open this repository, GitHub is mostly, you need to think about what this is at this point. If I have my account, Corey at MakeHaven, I've got repositories that are then tied into that. So it's taking a while to load that. But the repositories here, these are the folders that I've got as separate projects on GitHub, right? So this one, I just have one folder. I don't have anything exciting going on in it. And if I go into the template page for Foundations of Fabrication, I've got a license and a README file, right? And so there's only a few things that are happening here. But when I have this platform, right? This platform lets me be able to do lots of things. And so in here, I can make edits and changes. I can do that directly in here. So if I wanted to edit a particular file, you can do that in GitHub, but it's terrible. I would strongly recommend that you don't do that. Instead, what you can do is get your VS Code tied directly to it. So VS Code I have pulled up over here. These are all of these files, and I'd like to get these connected to my repository up here. So if you've made something in GitHub and you have a link to it, there's several ways that you can connect. But the big one that I want to show you right now is that this is what I've got in my folder here. And those are all in a folder. Let's see, I would like to pull up, we're just going to go with this. So in here, I can show you that there's, in VS Code, there's a terminal. Come on. I can make a terminal. So terminals within VS Code let you, or is the same as a PowerShell outside of VS Code. So you can get to a terminal right within Visual Studio Code, and I need to check that this works on a Mac, but I believe that it should. And so I think it does. And so with that, we can try and make these things connected to each other. So as you're getting set up, so if you haven't done this before, you'll download and install Git, which comes from that git-scm website. It's a program that you'll need to install. Then you'll have to do some setup things. So in that, you start to write in commands just like this. So I'm going to be writing in commands that are like this one. For first time git setup. So I left this particular computer set up so that I would need to do some git config. So with this, I have git config and then global user.name Corey Rice. And so up here, it's still a little bit hard to see, and I know that that's, let's see if I can get this a bit bigger. But this is just putting in one line of code. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a setting inside of Git, the program, on this computer, so that it knows that globally, I'm setting a configuration so that globally it knows my name is Corey Rice. So that when I link it to my GitHub, it'll be able to identify me and know that it's me that set it up. So this is a command that you only really need to run once. And I didn't get any errors, so it's saved that it's me. Then there's several things that you'd want to do to try and get this all connected. So I'm in a folder right now, and I can try and do git pull, and I want to get this connected to this remote file folder. So I would need to do git remote add. And so Git is the program, remote is that I want to work with the remotes, add is a command that I'd like to add a command, and I want to add something that's called origin, because then origin is the name of that remote. So you have to set up a name for the particular remote that you're going to be using, and then you need to tell it where it lives. So GitHub as a service just takes your URL up here. So if I'm in the main repository, I'm looking at just this template page for FOF, I grab that and copy it. I can come back to VS Code and I can just paste that in. So when I paste that in, this is going to make a remote that's named origin. I'm adding it to the remotes of this folder, and then we'll get it right there. Oh, it needs to be git init. You have to do this to get started in there, and then I can run that command again. And so it's a little tricky what just happened, but git init starts tracking a folder with git. Git add remote then connected it to my GitHub, and then I can do a command that's git pull origin master, and it will pull down information. Git. Oop. Sorry. We'll do delete. Move recycle bin. Git pull origin. All right. So what it did is it connected the two things together, and I pulled down from GitHub all of these two files. So I connected the two things together, and I pulled those two files down. It was a little tricky. I should have deleted them from my local before I tried to pull. There's some conflictness in there, and so Git has a little bit, it can be tricky, but we're going to try and set you up with a format that really works in a way that's consistent all the time. So when we do this, we've got a link to our format, and I've got all these things that are in here. I should be able to use this terminal to add in more commands as we go. Is that in frame at all, Kate? Or should I move it up on the screen?
I moved the lower third down.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, so let's do this full screen. And so as we're doing that, we can do git add star, and this is going to take the process of all of these files in here that are green. Those are additions to the Git project. It's just seeing those as new things. So if I do git add star, I get a few errors, but these aren't red errors, which is important. It's saying that it's going to take the line endings and change them to a different type of line ending, and that's fine. So this is something that you might see that this is going to be replaced by a Linux-friendly line ending. And then we can do git commit, if I can spell. And then you put in a little message with a commit, and you say in class. So here I've just got a little message that's going to come in like that, and it's created all of these different things, and then I can do a git push origin master. And so at this point, what it's doing is it's taking all of those, it needs me to log in on here, so just a second. It's asking me to do, so that you can see what it's doing. Corey.
And this all has to be done on a terminal.
It'll have to be done, it does not have to be done in terminal. There are GUI ways to do it, but a terminal is probably going to be the best thing to do. There are also lots of examples and tutorials on how to do it. And so I'm going to send out several of those that you can watch. Following one of those is going to get you set up the first time. It's how I learned to get set up the first time. It will be how you get set up to learn the first time, because this is hard to sort of explain and walk through. What I want to do is get to a point where we can make some changes and then go from there.
Can you explain the difference between a commit and a push?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it like saving and then making live?
A commit puts it in your log, and so a commit will save that you have made changes, and a push takes it from your local computer to the remote server. so that we have this. And so now you can see that several things have happened. It says it's enumerated the 22 objects that were made. It counted those things. It compressed. It set them into threads. It did some uploading where it resolved any changes that had happened from the local to the remote. Most of this you won't need to read, but ultimately it's saying that it uploaded the things to GitHub. And so if I come back to the GitHub page, if I come back to here and I hit refresh, now all of those items have been saved into the cloud. So all the files that I had locally were pushed into here, and if we were to open one up, like if we were to open up index.html, it says my portfolio. Getting it set up is tricky, and so it's a little stressful to do a live demo, but here it is. If I head back over to VS Code, instead of my portfolio, I can say my awesome portfolio, hit save, and then back through here. If I maybe that was a bigger change, right? In theory, that could have been a much more important change where I'd want to log it again. What's up?
Question. So I noticed you have like an emoticon in there, and typically there's like some sort of, for HTML, some sort of alphanumeric, but either way works fine.
Either way works fine. It's true, because
Can you have him, Corey, can you repeat the question?
Code set. So those are its own whole Unicode character sets for emojis. It is, but the system has to have a way to render it, so
Yeah.
VS Code has one, and browsers all.
And also,
Yeah, what was the question?
Hey, Corey?
is there a need to move it to the staging area from your local repository?
If you're pulling, you don't need to do that. We're going to go through the cycle right now of what you would want to do if you have made a change. So getting it set up and linked the
Corey,
first time can be tricky, and I'd encourage you to do that when there's basically nothing in the folder. So you want to make the first link happen then, but then you're going to go through this series of commands. So git pull origin master. I might even be able to make my font bigger. Can I do that? Oh yeah, I can. Okay. Look at that. Giant font. Git pull origin master. So this is going to pull from the remote. The reason why I do that is you saw how I had a conflict the first time and then I tried to quickly fix it. If you pull, it will give you this lovely message that says it's already up to date. If you don't get an already up to date right before you go to commit something, it means that probably you edit it in GitHub, the website, and then you've got a change there that's in conflict with your changes locally, right? And so if that happens, then you need to resolve those conflicts. And for a first-time user, that can be fairly complicated to make happen. So we're just gonna say, as a general practice, do git pull origin master. And if this doesn't come back, everything's already up to date, reach out to me.
I think especially if we're coming from the back of the room, there's just a request for you to repeat questions. I think it was hard to
Oh yeah. Well, Gada's question was about, do emojis work everywhere? And yeah, they have character codes. So that's a good point, but I will try and repeat all the questions. So we have this, we did our git pull origin master. Next up is git add star. So this is going to add any changes that we made to our code. It's going to add to the staging area. And so the only change should be that it says my awesome portfolio. So we added that word. So if I do git add star, it's going to give me a LF will be replaced by CRLF, and that's fine. Then we do a git commit. Our message here is going to be added awesomeness. And then we make that message happen. And then from there, we can do a git push origin master. So now it's taking those changes, it's identifying the delta that needs to happen. There's just a couple of changes, and so it pushes that up to GitHub. So if we hop back over to GitHub, and you see right now, this is still the previous loaded thing. It just says my portfolio. But if we hit refresh, my awesome portfolio is pulled in. So it can pull in that granular of data. It's got it completely backed up in the browser, and all of that is really useful for us. So even more so, if we head back over to here. Yeah?
What language are you using for terminal?
I think the language would be Bash. The good news is you won't need to know a whole lot, and maybe Cedric can correct me or Cedric or Aaron, but it's just a few commands. So you'll just be writing those few commands. You won't need a whole language worth of knowledge at this point. You're just going to need to know those things. So zooming this out a touch, getting ourselves oriented here. If I wanted to see every change that I've made to these files, I can run the command git log. Whoops, that's like in the middle somehow. Enter. I'll do git log. And so git log pulls up every one of these things that had happened. So the initial commit, the in-class commit, and then added awesomeness. So it's a list of every save that I had made while we were standing right here. So you can see that it was done by me, sort of who it was, the email address, the timestamps, all of that. And if I wanted to check out one of these, I could come back to here, and there's a checkout command that's also interesting, but we're not going to go into for right now. But this log, hopefully you can see, is useful just that it has a complete record of every time you've committed your files. So it's got a full set of saves that's backed up in both locations. So all of those commits are tracked here, and when you push them, they're tracked on GitHub as well.
Does that automatically cut out of the log after you hit the last commit? Does it come back to PowerShell?
Once you hit that, it goes to, yeah, so to repeat the question, once I push it, so maybe let me just rephrase it a little bit.
I was just talking about the log.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, for the log and the commits, does that automatically bring it back to PowerShell after it's listed all those commits?
I think you need to hit Control-C to jump out of the log.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Control-C will often get you out of things that you're doing in the PowerShell, which is the close command. Copy doesn't work the same way. What's up?
So if you don't write push, git push, it won't put it in GitHub?
Right, you'll have the log locally, which can be useful if you want to go back and look at old versions. But push is really where the magic happens, because it pushes it to GitHub and it's saved there. So that you have the full complete backup there. You may decide that you don't want to push all of your commits at once, or you may want to push a few at a time. But I'm going to just recommend, because we're probably all pretty new to this, that you just go through the cycle of you pull, you add, you commit, and then you push. And if you want to do a save, you do those 4 commands, where you pull, add, commit, and push. Just because that rhythm you can deviate from, but for the time being, it'll be helpful to have all of that there.
So once you push it, you have a full copy of all of your files and your code on your local and on the remote on GitHub.
Yep.
And so even if you were disconnected from the internet, then you would be able to reverse any version on
Yes.
your local user time.
And that's one of the important and powerful things about Git is that
Corey,
since
can
it's
you
stored
repeat?
locally, even if your internet is off, if you're in the woods far away from anything, you can still go check out previous versions of your code on your local machine without needing to be on the internet, right? So you've got that difference from something like Dropbox.
Our remote folks didn't hear what
Oh, the question was, can it work even without internet? And so the answer is yes. You can use Git and Git log and Git checkout and make commits even without internet connectivity, which is a really powerful part of it, so that you can use it even when you're in remote areas, when you're far away from the rest of the world and the internet. Or if, something even more terrible happens in 2020 and we all lose internet for a day or two. So those sorts of things are really helpful with Git because it serves that purpose. What's up?
Lila had asked a while back, is Git on WordPress or do you have to use a backup plugin?
So that is a good point. Git, and so 38% of the web is built on WordPress, and I am probably not as much of a WordPress aficionado as I should be, but because it's so important, my guess is that it does have a Git integration. And if Nedrick could nod if you know if that's true. Cedric? Yeah, sure. Cedric thinks it's true, that there's an integration between Git and WordPress. I don't know it off the top of my head, but we can dig through and try and find it if you're interested. But here's where I'm going to show you the value of Git and why we're encouraging GitHub. Because not only does it serve that entire backup purpose, but now I can go into this program. So if I'm in this repository in my GitHub account and I go to settings, in the settings there are many different things that you can adjust. There's settings that you can go with. You can change the name. You can get all sorts of stuff in here. But the one that's the most important is this GitHub pages. And so you might have played around with pages or templates. We sent out a link to this, to something like this earlier in the week. But at this point, the files that I have that are local would be a website. But when I go into GitHub Pages, it says that it's got no source for a web page based out of GitHub. But if I just choose out of the master branch, which is the main set of files, you can branch, and that's its own whole complicated thing that we're not going to be able to cover. And just out of the root folder, out of the main folder, or you could do from the docs folder, which we're just doing the main folder, you can say save. And then up here, it tells me that my GitHub Pages source was saved. So down here, it says your site is ready to be published at this link. So I'm going to actually copy it really quickly. But if I go to that link, there we go. This is it. This is the website hosted at corey@makehaven.github.io, template page for FOF. This is the website that was written with files that was pushed to GitHub. So these are all sourced from GitHub, but it's turned into a website that's hosted for free directly out of GitHub. The URL isn't lovely, but you can change that. You can get a domain name and have that redirected. But the big thing is that right now, GitHub as a service, Git and then GitHub as a partner service, will back up all of your files. It'll let you access them even if your internet is out. You can go through your whole log system. It tracks changes line by line in code or in images when you make adjustments there. In just the same way, those get monitored and tracked. And then also, you can host a website from it. So this is, I might still need to go around, make sure that all this works. There's JR, do a few different things. But this is able to host all these things for me as one singular solution. So coming back, if we go back enough that we're actually looking at GitHub. This, yeah.
Are there limitations on what sort of files it will track the changes for? So like right now we're dealing with mostly various sort of code and text editing
Right.
stuff. So that's like a very small amount of data. The deltas between versions are like adding a couple of characters.
Right.
Or maybe adding a few hundred characters or whatever. But would it do that with like a Photoshop file or like a 3D model or like a video?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so just to repeat it, because I'm getting slightly better at this, the question was, will Git work with all kinds of files? Because as of right now, it seems like we're just using it with code. And the short answer is yes, it'll work with just about everything. There is a limit to like how much file size you're going to get to have for free. So in a minute, I'm going to talk about how to host things on a service like Flickr, so you can have images or large files stored elsewhere, or you can compress your images so that they're smaller. There's a limit, sort of like all of these cloud services have a limit to how much storage you can use. But if you're just writing a simple website and then linking to videos that are external, you're not going to run up against it.
So if I may add to this, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Corey can't. Corey? Can you hear me?
I'm going to go in there and turn up the TV. I think just the volume must have gotten turned down.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Would track like all of the changes in those files, and you could log those like different stage points.
So the question is, so if you have a full like terabyte worth of data, would it be able to log and back all of that up in Git? If you're editing video files or things like that.
Like you're not gonna
Look at that.
push a terabyte to GitHub, obviously.
Right.
Or if you do,
Right.
you'll be paying a hell of a lot.
Right, it would be very expensive, but Git, the service, has no, as far as I'm aware, has no binders that say you can't use this particular type of file. So in theory, that would totally work. It would just take a long time to do the transfer from one file, from one location to another, because you're limited on network travel speeds at that point. But yeah, you could in theory, you know, if you're a movie video editor, and at the end of the day you don't have a render, so you just want to save what you're doing, you could run those commands and have it
Corey?
saved to a remote server in another location, right? So that overnight you're not worried about the time, but it does give you that full backup and log.
Oh,
Corey, can you hear me? Corey?
Right.
No? No Corey.
well,
Do I need to ring the guy or call him?
Yes, you can, and it's very good for that. One thing that makes it tricky is because you're getting that full backup, is that you don't get that sort of for free. You do have to have a lot of the file recreated in the backup. So you don't get it. There is a cost to having a large file backed up. Git almost duplicates your data, just so that if it keeps every version, right, it needs to store all of that information with it as well. Are we waiting on something?
There's people have been trying to talk and we haven't been able to hear them.
Oh,
But then I turned on the volume and there's an echo, so there's something that's not working quite like last time.
Okay, gotcha.
So I just want to take a moment because people are trying to talk and I can't.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe people online can talk.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll mute.
Is it because it's coming out of your
Corey, can you hear me? No?
All right, so
Can you hear me?
yes. Cedric.
I don't think this is working. Can you hear me?
You sound great to us.
Yeah, it seems to be working from my end, but Corey seems clueless right now, so I don't think he's hearing anything. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, you can? Awesome. So I was saying, so technically a few things about GitHub that are important. So first, there's no one file that can be more than 100 megabytes. So technically, you cannot do the video editing or anything like this. And please understand, I like the idea and I like the thought process of, hey, wait a minute, I can back up my entire life on this thing. I like that process, but technically you can't. The free account is gonna give you 1 gigabyte. And please understand that there's no limitations to the file type, but this was built able to be displayed on that website is really just code. So there's really no point in backing up anything else. If you back up photos or anything, it's not going to bring you any feature of like changes to the pictures. It doesn't handle any of this. So basically, it's great as long as it's a file. And to go back to the question that was asked, like, can WordPress work with this? It only works with files. So if you have a WordPress that's hosted somewhere else, you're not going to be able to use Git directly. You have to be hosting it and have access to the files. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so he said that there's, just because our sound was working, our sound was sort of working. So our sound was sort of working on this end. It was, and I think Kate, can you mute yours?
You didn't hear anything?
We're having audio issues.
So it's 100 megabytes on any one file and 1 gigabyte total.
Yeah, I don't know. We're gonna have to.
GitHub, not Git. So GitHub has that limit. It means that video editing would be. It means that video editing would be tricky and not possible on GitHub. But Git, in theory, could work. The important piece for GitHub is that essentially it keeps us constrained. So if you're going to be putting your files for photos in GitHub, you'll want to think about what exactly are you putting in and compressing those photos if you want to put them in directly. If you want to host them on something like Flickr, then you can often have an exchange that comes back and forth, where you'd upload your photos onto a service like Flickr, and then you can pull them in. But there's lots of different ways to make that work. Flickr is a good service, though, that I have used in the past. You can store, and so, how are we doing with things? We're good?
Make
Okay.
sure we're aware of time too.
Yeah. So we're at it for time. The good news is that we basically have hit all of the things that I really wanted to get through. The GitHub as a service, you've got those 4 commands. Let's head back to the Foundations page where we're taking a look at this. I've got, here are the 3 big ones. If you never ever are going to edit files on GitHub itself, you could in theory get away with add, commit, and push. But I think it's just best practice for every one of you to do pull, add, commit, push. That'll be your cycle to get things uploaded to GitHub. And as a general rule, even though it can handle photos and videos, be best to limit that so that you don't hit your 100 megabyte file thing and that you don't hit the 1 gigabit limit. If you can keep it to code and formatting, you're going to be better off. And then from there, we can work on how to develop it further into websites and those sorts of things. But it does do, for all of your content for the class, it should be enough for a backup of everything. And you can look at versions, and you can host your website from it. So as a service, we're going to encourage everybody to make a Git repository this week. Get yourself tied into that. And if that happens super quickly, you can start to think about woodworking badges, because that's where we're headed next. And so woodworking badges, it's a nice hard turn from code. Woodworking with a saw and a chisel is a far more hands-on activity. And so it'll be nice to sort of leave this one realm after a week or so and get into something that's hands-on if that's more your bend. And we'll try and keep bouncing back and forth between those skill sets. But Git tutorials, we have several linked. I'll be pushing up more through the foundations thing. And then we're good. I think we should probably take a quick bio break, bathroom break, get up and walk, stretch around, do what we need to do that way so that we can have a little bit of downtime. And then we'll see if we can actually see any websites that people have put together.